She stepped out of his life on an afternoon as ordinary as any other. There were no tears, no arguments. Only the silence of someone who no longer wished to stay, and the stillness of someone who chose not to hold on. They had once been everything to each other. But love sometimes is not enough. And when the door closed behind her, what remained inside him was not anger, but a very real emptiness. 1. Hurt but unbroken. On the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado, where snow-capped peaks wait on the horizon and the wind sighs through the pines like a whispered memory, there was a man named Jack. The woman he loved, the woman he had planned to ask to marry him that coming spring, walked away after 5 shared years. There were no harsh words, no clear betrayal, just a slow shift, tiny cracks appearing day by day, until her heart no longer lived in the same place as his. And then she was gone, as if she had never stayed long enough to leave roots. Jack could have reached for a bottle. He could have called in the dark hours of the night, begging for explanations or second chances. He could have folded beneath the weight, as many have. But he didn't. Instead, every morning he laced his shoes and ran, past the leaf-strewn road, past the coffee shop where her laughter once filled the air, and all the way up the western hill overlooking the city, the place where sunsets once belonged to them both. He stood there alone, not pretending to be invincible. Tears did fall, but his stance remained steady. It wasn't because he didn't hurt. It was because he knew if he let the pain steer him, it would destroy the most beautiful parts of who he was. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Jack didn't deny his feelings. He faced them, let them move through him like a passing storm, but refused to let them carry him away. He held on to the quiet core, the stillness that a Stoic man knows he must guard, even when the world outside is falling apart. Because Jack understood one thing with bone-deep clarity. If he surrendered to grief, he would lose more than the woman. He would lose himself. Had he begged, had he reached for her out of desperation, he would have surrendered the respect he owed his own soul. And once a man trades away his self-respect, there is little left to rebuild. A weaker man fills the void with noise, whiskey, bodies, midnight messages, hollow distractions. But pain waits patient, circling back when the night is quiet. Jack needed no sympathy from the world, only a promise to himself: whoever leaves me, I will not abandon me. And that is why, on that familiar hill, Jack could let the tears fall and still remain an unbroken man. 2. Ask for no pity, reach for control. I once met a man named Mark in New York City. A well-respected attorney, he had built nearly his entire adult life around the rhythms of the woman he loved. 5 years together, every vacation planned with her in mind, every late night at the office endured for the future he imagined for them both. And then one ordinary afternoon, she ended it. No anger, no slammed doors, just a single quiet sentence: "I need to follow a different calling in my life." Mark could have asked, why? He could have called her in the dark hours, written long, desperate messages like confessions, or sought sympathy in the eyes of colleagues over drinks. But he did none of those things. The very next day, at exactly 5 o'clock, he closed his laptop, a small action, yet the first time in 10 years he'd left work early for himself. He walked home through the winter streets, bought a simple cookbook on a whim, and began an unexpected journey, teaching himself to cook, not for anyone else, not to impress, not to post on social media, just for himself. Each evening he prepared a real meal at his small kitchen table. Alone. No camera. No applause. No witnesses. Only to remind himself, I am still here. I am still worth caring for. Mark didn't need pity. He needed to reclaim mastery over his own life. As Epictetus once wrote, do not seek for events to happen as you wish, but wish for them to happen as they do, and you will go on well. That was the philosophy Mark chose. He could not control her decision, but he could control his own, every step, every thought, every quiet ritual that rebuilt the architecture of his days. Because when the world outside collapses, a Stoic man doesn't go searching for a savior. He finds his anchor within. Had Mark chosen weakness, he might have dialed her number on sleepless nights, poured whiskey to dull theatre, or scrolled endlessly for traces of her life online, like a man abandoned at sea. And in doing so, he would have surrendered the quiet dignity he had once held dear. But Mark rose quietly, with small, deliberate acts, folding his laundry neatly, choosing clean shirts, keeping meal times sacred, and eating as though he were a man still deserving of tenderness, even in an empty kitchen. Strength for a Stoic man isn't in grand gestures of defiance, it's in restoring order, piece by piece, like an artist stitching his soul back together. And so I ask you, if you lost the one you love today, what would you choose to begin again with yourself? Don't rush to answer. Let that question follow you into the night. 3. He treated pain like a martial art. Seattle is a city that wears rain like a second skin. Showers arrive without warning, breaking open like emotions you haven't yet named. That's where I met Dean, a fitness trainer, strong, even-tempered, the kind of man you'd think nothing could ever bring to his knees. But when the woman he loved most walked away, what stunned him wasn't her leaving. It was the quiet realization that he had lost himself long before she stepped out the door. Dean didn't lose her in one explosive argument. He lost her in 100 small silences, in 1,000 moments when he erased his own boundaries just to keep her smiling. Each soft nod, each quiet compromise he didn't believe in was another crack forming in his own foundation. And then she was gone. Not for someone else, but because Dean was no longer Dean. She couldn't see the fire in his eyes anymore. Only a man clinging to her like sand slipping through his fingers. In the first days after the breakup, Dean threw himself into the gym, not to escape, but to confront. Each punch against the heavy bag wasn't aimed at her, it was aimed at himself, the man who had allowed love to erode his edges. It was there, amid sweat and silence, that Dean began to learn again, to love himself the way he had once loved her. Dean told me, I don't blame her anymore. I blame myself for not being clear enough to earn her respect. His words brought to mind Seneca's wisdom. It's not because things are difficult that we dare not do them. It's because we dare not do them that they are difficult. Had Dean refused to learn, he might have become the darker version of himself, the man who hides in the gym to nurse old wounds, who retreats from the world, who grows bitter toward women and shields himself instead of loving again. But a Stoic man doesn't live for revenge. He lives to understand, to rebuild stronger and steadier. Dean didn't need a new relationship to feel worthy. He needed only to reclaim what he'd surrendered, clarity, balance, and self-respect. And now I ask you, are you nodding along to things you don't believe in, just to keep someone from leaving? 4. Don't live to be loved. Live to have worth. In a small town outside Austin, Texas, where summer heat softens even the asphalt, there lived a man named Caleb. A quiet software engineer with a simple life, he had once loved a woman whose spirit was like the wind, free, dreamy, and never still long enough to build anything lasting. She didn't leave because Caleb wasn't good enough. She left because her heart had never belonged anywhere. And after she was gone, Caleb found himself replaying every moment, wondering if being more reckless, less careful, or a little less kind might have made her stay. He nearly lost his sense of direction. But one silent evening, he sat down at an old piano he hadn't touched since college, a piano he'd abandoned for work, for love, for the grind of busy living. When the first notes drifted into the empty room, no one heard. No one praised him. But for the first time in months, a missing piece of himself slid quietly back into place. From that night on, Caleb gave an hour each evening to the piano. Not for anyone's ears, not to impress, simply to feel alive again. And in that quiet ritual, he began to heal. A Stoic man does not seek value in someone else's gaze. He builds it in the way he lives, in habits, in discipline, in the small, unseen choices that shape a life. Caleb didn't need a new love to feel significant. He only needed purpose. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do what is right, not what is popular." Had he chased attention, he might have scrolled for validation or rushed into shallow flings, only to feel emptier each day. Instead, he chose another path, silent, steady, and alive. And I ask you, if tomorrow no one applauds, will you still live with dignity? 5. Dignity cannot be taken. Winter in Chicago bites to the bone. The wind slides beneath collars, searching for a way to pierce even the most guarded heart. In that frozen cityscape, I think of Eli, a freelance photographer with gentle eyes and a quiet smile, who once believed he'd found his final companion in life. For 3 years they loved quietly. No grand gestures, no dazzling promises, just the small certainties. A cup of coffee already waiting each morning, evening walks by the lake, where words were scarce but presence was enough. Then one day she left. No explanation, no phone call, no final message. Eli stood inside that emptiness, silent, like a lake disrupted by a single stone, its ripples searching endlessly for an answer they would never reach. Friends urged him to speak up, to tell his side, to expose the truth. But Eli only shook his head. Not because he was weak, because he understood this. The moment you must defend your character, you've already placed it in someone else's hands. As Epictetus wrote, "Anyone who can anger you becomes your master. Choose wisely who holds power over you." Eli didn't need healing through spectacle. He didn't need vindication or a crowd to take his side. He needed to keep the one thing that mattered, his dignity. Because if he had chosen to complain, to assign blame, or to beg for sympathy, he would have turned that breakup into a cheap performance. And in that theater, he would have lost the quiet nobility he still owned. A Stoic man knows some things are not protected by words, they are protected by silence. Eli said nothing. Yet in that silence was the clearest declaration. I don't need to be a hero, I just need to avoid becoming small. So I ask you, when someone leaves without a word, will you demand answers or hold on to your peace? Sometimes it's the way you exit that the world remembers, not for drama, but for the strength it takes not to react. 6. He chose to hurt once rather than suffer forever. In Portland, Oregon, there was a man named Henry, a carpenter who lived slowly, carefully, savoring simple things, a steaming mug of coffee in the morning, the sound of wood meeting wood in his workshop. The woman he loved once told him, "Being with you feels like breathing." And yet, one day, she left, quietly, as if their love had never been a home at all. One afternoon, while clearing out a drawer, Henry discovered her old letters. The paper had yellowed, the ink still carried a faint trace of her perfume. He sat down. No music. No messages. Just reading, line by line, the way someone reads the last chapter of a book, knowing there will be no sequel. When he finished, he did not cry. He burned the letters, not in anger, not in haste, but in a silence that spoke more than words could. A Stoic man does not preserve beautiful memories to torture himself. He lets go, not because he has forgotten, but because he knows that holding on too long becomes a chain. Had Henry been weaker, he might have written her again, whispering across the digital void, "Do you remember these letters?" And if her reply had been cold, he would have felt abandoned all over again, not by her, but by his own weakness. Seneca once wrote, "What you fear is not the death of love, but the loss of control over it." Henry understood. Returning because of loneliness is not love. It is merely postponing pain. So he chose to hurt once, cleanly. Like pulling a splinter buried deep in flesh, sharp, bloody, but necessary to heal. From that night on, Henry brewed tea each evening, for himself alone. He read, repaired old furniture, tended the small garden behind his shop. Not for anyone to see, but because he knew living gently with himself was the only way to heal without needing anyone else. So I ask you, are you clinging to something that cuts you daily, simply because you're afraid of the single pain of letting go? 7. Reborn in silence. In a small Michigan town, there was a man named Daniel. A mechanic with grease-streaked cheeks and calloused hands hardened by metal and years of labor. He was the kind of man no one imagined had ever loved so fiercely he once believed he'd marry her. But he had. And then she was gone. No shouting. No betrayal. Just one quiet sentence on an ordinary day. "I don't see myself in your life anymore." Daniel didn't beg. He didn't promise to change or fall to his knees. He simply nodded and opened the truck door, letting her step out of his life. For the first week, he didn't go to church as usual. Didn't see his friends. Didn't fix a single car. He just sat in his garage, staring at the empty space where she had once stood, watching him work. But Daniel refused to let her absence become a permanent hollow. He began cleaning the garage, wiping down old tools, replacing a broken light, tuning the old radio she used to turn on each morning. Not to erase her, but to reclaim his place in the world, to make it whole again without her shadow. He didn't rush to find someone new. He didn't try to forget. Daniel chose rebirth. And from that silence, a new Daniel emerged, steadier, deeper, not because he stopped loving her, but because he'd learned how to love without losing himself. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to love, to act." Daniel lived that way, quietly, kindly, without needing to prove a thing. A year later, he attended a class reunion. He wasn't dazzling or dramatically transformed. But in his eyes was something that made people pause, peace. Not peace from having someone beside him, but from no longer having anything inside him screaming for rescue. Had he been weaker, he might have clung to her memory like a monument, sealing himself inside the house of the past, windows shuttered, light shut out. Instead, Daniel stepped forward, not to tell his story of pain, but to prove life can still be whole, even after invisible loss. And I ask you, are you waiting for someone to step in before your life feels meaningful? Or are you brave enough to create meaning from absence itself? Closing. A Stoic man does not live to prove anything. He lives to keep the promise he made to himself, that no matter who stays or leaves, he remains himself, unsoftened, unbroken. He does not need pity. He needs respect. Because love can shatter. But character, tempered in silence, will never disappear. If you are a man walking this road alone, leave a comment. I am not abandoned, I am reborn. And remember to subscribe. Some pains don't need to be healed, they only need to be understood.